I am Captain Natalie Brooks, though when this story began, I was still wearing the single silver bar of a first lieutenant. It was supposed to be the proudest day of my career, the day the words of the promotion order were read aloud inside the formal hall at Fort Bragg, the day the Army recognized years of sweat drills and missions. The polished oak stage gleamed under bright lights. American flags framed the room, and the rows of soldiers and officers sat in crisp uniforms. I stood at attention as the adjutant unfolded the paper and spoke with solemnity. By the order of the Secretary of the Army, First Lieutenant Natalie Brooks is promoted to the rank of captain. My heart pounded. This was the culmination of years of discipline, a moment every officer dreams of. When my name echoed across the room, I felt the weight of history pressing down and lifting me up at the same time. I stepped forward to receive the new rank insignia, the twin silver bars that symbolize responsibility and trust. My father, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Carter, was invited to pin them on my shoulders. He marched toward me with the precision of decades in uniform, his chest full of ribbons, his face carved into the mask of a commander. For one flickering second, I thought I saw a trace of pride in his eyes, but even then, I wondered if it was pride in me or pride in himself. He lifted the insignia with deliberate care, and as the hall fell into hushed reverence, he reached to fix them on my collar. I should have been safe. Instead, in that very instant, my stepbrother Ethan Carter burst from the audience like a storm breaking through a fragile wall. Before anyone could react, he was on the stage. His hand crashed against my chest, and I stumbled, confused, disoriented, struggling to understand why he was there at all. Then his fist struck my face. The sharp crack reverberated through the silence, followed by the sickening pop in my arm as I fell to the floor bones, screaming in agony. Gasps rose from the audience, but no one moved. My vision blurred, my cheek burned, and hot blood slid down my temple, staining the fresh-pressed fabric of my uniform. I tried to rise, tried to salvage dignity on the very stage meant to honor me, but Ethan kicked again, sending pain lancing through my side. I could hear his ragged breath above me, triumphant, like this was not a promotion ceremony, but his stage, his victory. My bars had fallen to the floor, the shining symbols of authority scattered like worthless trinkets. The room had become a cage of shame. The military police finally rushed forward, boots striking the floor, in unison, weapons drawn to halt the chaos. For a heartbeat, I believed order would be restored. But then I heard the one voice that mattered most, calm, cold, commanding. "Stand down. This is family business." My father's voice cut through the air sharper than any blade. The MPs froze. Their eyes flicked between my broken body, my furious attacker, and the silver eagle on my father's collar, the emblem of his rank and authority. Then one by one, they lowered their hands. They obeyed him. In that moment, the promise of justice collapsed. No one intervened. Not a single colonel or major in the audience moved. They looked away, pretending it was nothing more than a family quarrel. My father did not kneel to help me. He did not condemn Ethan. He simply adjusted his posture and stared down with a face that could have been carved from stone. On the floor, every breath was agony, every heartbeat a reminder that the very institution sworn to uphold honor had abandoned me at its altar. My mind screamed with betrayal as loud as the throbbing in my skull. This was the army I had sworn to serve. This was the family I had struggled to please, and both had chosen silence. The applause that should have crowned my career was replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing, the taste of copper in my mouth, and the memory of my father's order. "Stand down." I realized then that my fight was no longer for recognition, but for survival, not just of my body, but of my truth. And if you have ever stood in a moment when justice was smothered before your eyes, then you know the kind of silence that follows heavy, suffocating, and unforgettable. People often assume that those who wear the uniform come from families built on discipline, respect, and loyalty. But my childhood was proof that you can live inside a house that looks perfectly American from the outside and still grow up in a war zone of a different kind. My earliest memories of my father, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Carter, were not of bedtime stories or gentle praise, but of commands barked across the dinner table as if he were addressing a formation. "Sit up straight, eyes forward. Do not speak unless spoken to." Even as a child, I understood he saw me less as a daughter and more as a soldier. He could mold one he did not quite trust to carry his name without flaw. When my mother passed away, I was only 8, and the small warmth I had clung to vanished overnight. My father remarried quickly to Linda, a woman whose smile charmed guests, but whose eyes carried the cold gleam of calculation. With her came Ethan the boy who would become the shadow over every step of my youth. Ethan was loud, careless, and cruel, yet to my father he was a golden son. I can still remember the first time the imbalance revealed itself. I was 12, standing in the living room as relatives visited. My father asked me to recite the Army values he drilled into me daily, and I stumbled over the order swapping loyalty and duty. Before I could correct myself, Linda's hand cracked across my face, sharp and swift, and she hissed that I had embarrassed Richard in front of his peers. My cheek burned and my pride burned hotter, but what I remember most is my father's silence. He did not defend me. He did not stop her. He merely looked at me with disappointment as if I had failed him on parade. Ethan, meanwhile, never needed to prove himself. If he skipped school, my father chuckled that boys will be boys. When he picked fights in the neighborhood, Richard laughed and called it toughness. If I raised my voice to protest, Linda would tighten her grip on my shoulder and whisper that no one believed a sulking girl over a proud son. Year after year, the double standard became ironclad. Ethan was celebrated. I was diminished. Holidays felt like inspections. Thanksgiving dinners were less about gratitude and more about which of us could shine in Richard's eyes. Ethan would boast of minor sports trophies and receive claps on the back while I quietly showed straight A report cards only to be told grades were not the measure of character. I learned early that achievement would not buy me a seat at my father's table of pride. By high school, I had started to map out my escape. I watched ROTC cadets march across the football field, their uniforms crisp, their faces set with determination. To me, they looked free, not because they lacked rules, but because their rules had meaning unlike the twisted code inside my own home. Joining ROTC became my plan not just for a career, but for survival. I told myself that if I could earn my commission, if I could stand on my own in the Army, then my father would finally have to acknowledge me. I remember the day I brought home the acceptance papers. My heart was pounding with hope, waiting for a rare smile, maybe even pride. Instead, Richard read the letter, nodded once, and said, "Do not expect favors. You will have to earn twice as much respect as anyone else." Ethan smirked beside him, already knowing the truth. I would only admit years later. No matter what I achieved, it would never be enough to erase the sin of not being the son Richard wanted. Linda reinforced it every chance she had. When Ethan wrecked the family car, she claimed the mechanic had lied about the brakes. When I came home late from a study group, she accused me of tarnishing the family's honor. Once at a holiday party, Richard poured whiskey for his fellow officers and spoke proudly of Ethan's leadership potential, even as Ethan slurred drunkenly beside him. I stood nearby holding a tray of glasses in visible seething until Linda leaned close and whispered that I would understand my place. Once I accepted that men carry the family legacy and women simply endure. Those words branded me. They made me vow that I would not simply endure. I would break the pattern. But vows are easier than survival. The years between 16 and 20 were a minefield of insults, punishments, and subtle erasures. My father insisted I attend every ceremony he hosted, not as a daughter to be honored, but as a servant to set tables, polish medals, and fetch drinks. Ethan strutted around in borrowed ROTC uniforms for costume parties while I drilled until my muscles ached. Sometimes I lay awake at night and wondered if I was training for my own freedom or for a mirage of his approval that would never arrive. By the time I left for college and joined the ROTC unit at UNC Chapel Hill, I felt both liberated and terrified. Liberated because I could finally step outside the Carter household, terrified because I knew failure would send me crawling back into its walls. My father's words haunted me. Earn twice as much respect. I carried them like a burden and a fuel at the same time. When I marched across campus with my fellow cadets, I straightened my spine, not just against the weight of the pack, but against the weight of every sneer Ethan had thrown at me. Looking back now, I realized that my childhood did not just prepare me for the Army. It carved me into someone who would fight not only enemies across a battlefield, but enemies within my own blood. The Carter name was supposed to shield me, but instead it forged the very cage I had to escape. When I first put on the uniform of a second lieutenant, I thought I had finally stepped out of the long shadow of Richard Carter. Commissioning through ROTC at UNC Chapel Hill was more than a graduation, it was an emancipation. I still remember the hot May sun on my face as the oath was spoken. My right hand raised my voice, steady even as my heart raced. I swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and for the first time those words felt personal. The domestic enemy I thought of was not foreign terrorists or rival nations, but the grip of my father's expectations, the smirk of my stepbrother, the cold judgment of Linda. That oath was my escape clause, my chance to belong to something larger than their cage. My assignment orders came soon after Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home to the 82nd Airborne Division, a place where legends were made. The envelope was thick with official paper, the black ink crisp, and when I read my name next to the line, Second Lieutenant Transportation Corps, I pressed it against my chest like it was armor. Walking onto the installation for the first time, I felt the immensity of it, the vast parade fields, the endless barracks, the cadence of boots hitting pavement in perfect rhythm. It was a city of order, a place where rank and responsibility meant more than bloodline or favoritism. At least that was what I wanted to believe. Those first months tested me harder than anything my childhood had prepared me for. Officer Basic Course was relentless. Long hours of convoy operations, field exercises under a punishing sun, evaluations where one wrong decision could define your reputation for years. Chain of command was not abstract. Here, it was alive. A captain could end your career with a single counseling statement. A colonel could shape your future with a nod or a shake of the head. I learned quickly that there were no shortcuts, no mercy, and no allowances. But unlike home here, my effort mattered. When I stayed up all night planning a logistics exercise, my platoon noticed. When I volunteered for the hardest assignments, my peers respected me. For once, the ledger-balanced work equaled recognition. That balance was intoxicating. I threw myself into every challenge. Night convoys through rain-slicked Carolina backroads, early morning PT when the fog still clung to the pines after action reviews where every mistake was dissected. Each task, each critique, each improvement was a rung on the ladder. I knew that one day those rungs would carry me to the silver bars of a captain. Yet even as I rose, the ghost of Richard Carter lingered. He never congratulated me, never sent a word of pride. Instead, he reminded me during rare phone calls that real officers were judged not by papers but by battlefield grit. Ethan, he said, had that grit in his blood. I listened in silence, knuckles white around the receiver, and told myself I would prove him wrong in the only way he understood, by excelling beyond his reach. My turning point came during a joint exercise when our convoy was ambushed with simulated IEDs. Chaos erupted, radios crackled, young soldiers froze. I barked orders, directed vehicles to alternate routes, and kept the mission moving. When we regrouped, my commander, a grizzled major with a reputation for tearing lieutenants apart, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You kept your head." That small acknowledgement fueled me for months. I pinned the after-action report on my wall like a trophy. By the end of my second year, whispers of a promotion began to circulate. My file was thick with commendations, my evaluations stamped with exceeds standard. I knew the process well. The packet would go before a board. Senior officers would review every line, and if selected, I would be recommended for captain. Still, when the promotion orders finally arrived, embossed with the seal and signed by a brigadier general, I felt like my breath had been stolen. Holding those papers, I remembered the day my father dismissed my ROTC acceptance with a nod. This time, no nod of his could diminish what I had earned. I was being elevated not because of his rank, not because of Ethan's games, but because of me. The date of the ceremony was set. The hall at Fort Bragg was reserved. The officers were invited. My uniform was tailored, my insignia polished, my speech rehearsed. I told myself this was it, the moment the Carter name would no longer chain me, but witness my triumph. Yet beneath the pride was a current of dread I could not shake. a fear that somehow Richard would find a way to twist even this milestone. I brushed it aside. I believed the Army's structure, its rules, its code of honor would protect me. I could not yet know how wrong I was. The day of my promotion dawned with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. The Carolina sky stretched wide and blue above Fort Bragg, the air thick with the smell of cut grass and polish from uniforms pressed to perfection. I had laid out my own Class A uniform the night before, smoothing every crease, checking every button, rehearsing every step I would take toward the stage. My name was printed on the program beside the words, "Promotion to Captain," and though my heart carried the scars of my family's cruelty for a few fragile hours, I let myself believe that today the uniform and the institution would eclipse everything else. The hall was grand flags lining the walls, brass gleaming, the low murmur of conversations blending into a solemn hum. Rows of soldiers filled the seats. Commanders in full dress blues, families with cameras ready. When my name was called, I rose spine straight, the echo of boots against hardwood loud in my ears. The adjutant read the order with the formal cadence drilled into Army tradition, by the order of the Secretary of the Army. First Lieutenant Natalie Brooks is promoted to the rank of captain. The words washed over me like a tide, lifting me higher than I had ever been. This was supposed to be the moment my father could not deny me, the moment when even Richard Carter would have to acknowledge that I had achieved something no smirk of Ethan's could tarnish. My father was invited to the stage to pin on my new rank insignia. He approached with his usual controlled stride, the silver eagle on his collar catching the light, the ribbons across his chest announcing decades of service. For the briefest moment as he reached to attach the bars, I imagined we were simply a father and daughter sharing pride. But before his hand could lower the insignia, chaos erupted. Ethan surged from the audience, his footsteps heavy, his face twisted with something between rage and triumph. He shoved past a startled major and leapt onto the stage. In one shocking instant, the ceremony shifted from solemnity to violence. His fist connected with my face, and the sound echoed in the silent hall. Pain radiated through my skull. My body staggered backward. My vision flashed white. The insignia slipped from my collar and clattered to the floor. Before I could recover, he struck again, his blow slamming into my arm with such force that I felt the bone snap, hot pain flooding through me. I cried out. The hall gasped, and yet no one moved. I fell to the ground, my uniform soaking with sweat and blood, the polished floor cold against my cheek. Ethan's boot lashed out, kicking me in the ribs, and the breath whooshed from my lungs. The hall that had moments before been filled with reverent silence now throbbed with gasps and muffled exclamations. I lifted my head, searching for help, for justice, for the chain of command that had always promised order. At last, the military police rushed forward, weapons-drawn faces set with determination. For one heartbeat, hope flared. They would stop him. They would restore the dignity of the uniform. But then came the words that shattered me more completely than any blow. "Stand down. This is family business." My father's voice, cold and authoritative, froze the MPs in their tracks. They looked at one another uncertain, then back at the eagle on his collar. Slowly, one by one, they obeyed. Their hands lowered their boots, shifted back. The command had been given, and the chain of command was obeyed. No one intervened. Not the colonels, not the majors, not the peers who had once clapped me on the back during training exercises. They all looked away, their eyes fixed on the floor, their mouths shut tight, pretending this was not happening on the stage of honor. I struggled to rise each movement, agony, my ribs screaming, my arm hanging useless. The bars of a captain lay on the floor beside me, untouched, gleaming like a cruel joke. Ethan loomed over me, his breath hot and heavy, his fists still clenched as if daring anyone to challenge him. My father did not move to help me. He did not denounce Ethan. He simply adjusted his uniform, his face unreadable, and turned back toward the audience as if the ceremony had only been slightly inconvenienced. The betrayal was sharper than any strike. The army that had promised order and justice, the father who should have been my protector, the commanders who should have upheld the code, all had abandoned me in one collective silence. Lying on that stage, gasping for air, my vision blurred. I realized this ceremony was not my elevation, but my humiliation. The applause I had dreamed of was replaced by whispers, the pride I had yearned for replaced by pity, the justice I had trusted replaced by complicity. The hall that should have crowned my career had become a courtroom of shame where the verdict was already decided: silence, obedience, and cover-up. The last thing I remember before darkness closed in was the sound of Ethan's laugh, low and victorious, and my father's voice again calm and final, repeating the words that would haunt me: "Stand down." When I opened my eyes again, the world was washed in white. The sterile glow of fluorescent lights flickered above me, the sharp tang of antiseptic filled my nose, and the faint beeping of monitors reminded me I was still alive. I was lying in a bed at Womack Army Medical Center, Fort Bragg's pride in military medicine. My body felt heavy, every nerve aching, my arms strapped in a cast, my ribs bound, the bandage across my temple itching. For a moment, disoriented, I thought perhaps order had been restored, that someone had finally seen sense and pulled Ethan away, that justice would begin here in the records of trained professionals sworn to heal and document truth. But when the door opened and I heard the hushed voices of staff, my fragile hope collapsed. A doctor in uniform with captain's bars on his shoulders glanced at my chart with a strange detachment. He did not ask me what happened, did not let me describe the attack. Instead, he murmured something about injuries consistent with a training accident, as though reading from a script. I forced out the words. My stepbrother did this. He attacked me in the ceremony in front of everyone, but the doctor avoided my eyes and scribbled in the file without acknowledgement. When I pressed, he simply said, "These reports go through the chain of command. Rest is what you need." The implication chilled me. The truth was already being erased. Later, as night deepened and the halls grew quieter, a nurse came to change my bandages. She was younger than most, her badge read, Carla Jennings, her hands gentle but her expression troubled. When she leaned close, she whispered so low I almost thought I had imagined it. "I know what really happened." Her eyes darted to the door as if she feared someone listening. She said my injuries had been classified in the system as sustained during routine training, the official box ticked by order from above. She shook her head, muttering that it was not the first time she had seen medical truth bent for the sake of a superior's pride. She promised me she would keep a private note, but begged me to be careful because fighting it would be dangerous. That moment was both a flicker of hope and a stab of despair. To have one witness was a gift, but to know the entire apparatus of record-keeping had been co-opted by Richard Carter was suffocating. The next morning, my father himself walked into the room still in uniform, his presence filling the sterile space like a toxin. He did not ask how I felt. He did not express concern for my injuries. He simply told me in the same clipped tone he used with subordinates that the official story was already sealed. Training accident. Nothing more. He leaned over me, his metals brushing my blanket, and warned me that if I spoke otherwise, I would not only disgrace myself but jeopardize my entire career. "Do you understand?" he said, eyes boring into mine. "The Army does not tolerate weakness or scandal." The weight of his authority was suffocating the realization that his reach extended even here, where my broken body should have been undeniable proof. He turned and left without waiting for my answer, as if my silence was agreement. Lying there, I stared at the ceiling and felt the crushing loneliness of knowing that the truth could be buried under paperwork and signatures, that the uniform I had trusted to shield me could just as easily be used to silence me. For days, I endured the routine of bandages, changed vitals checked, but always with the same false diagnosis in the charts. Visitors came and went, but none spoke of the attack. Officers nodded politely, offered shallow wishes for recovery, and left quickly, their eyes avoiding mine as though I were contagious with dishonor. The humiliation cut deeper than the pain in my ribs. To be invisible in the very institution I had served was a wound no medicine could bind. Only Carla Jennings would pause, adjust my pillow, and whisper small reassurances, hints that she would not forget what she had seen. But even she admitted quietly that her voice carried little weight against the might of a lieutenant colonel. Each night I lay awake listening to the echo of my father's words, wondering if this was how my career would end, not with recognition but with erasure. They had already taken my ceremony, my promotion, my dignity on stage. Now they were taking the record, the proof, the history. And yet even as despair pressed down on me, a seed of defiance began to grow. If they thought they could rewrite reality with ink and rank, they had underestimated the resilience forged in me by years of surviving their cruelty. I would not remain silent forever. When I was discharged from Womack and sent back to my quarters, I expected at least a trickle of compassion, maybe a text from family or a call from someone who had seen the attack with their own eyes. What I found instead was silence, so loud it pressed against my chest. My phone was empty of messages, and when I checked the Carter family group chat, the one thread where birthdays, holiday plans, and obligatory photos had always appeared, my name was gone. I had been removed as though I had never belonged. The banner that once read Brooks and Carter family had a new name, Carter Legacy. My breath caught when I saw Ethan posting a photo with my father, both of them in pressed shirts, smiling with the caption, "Family honor restored." The comments from distant relatives praised them, congratulating Ethan for standing by his father as if the entire assault at my ceremony had been twisted into an act of loyalty rather than violence. I scrolled through the thread with numb fingers searching for even one defense. One voice that questioned the narrative, but there was nothing. Not a cousin, not an aunt, not even a childhood friend from our circle dared to mention my name. At dinner in the officers' mess that first week back, I felt eyes on me but no words. Fellow lieutenants who had once laughed with me in the field now avoided my table. Their trays angled elsewhere, their conversations halting when I passed. It was as if my broken arm and bruised face had marked me not as a victim but as a contagion. Rumors spread quickly in a place like Fort Bragg, and I could hear whispers echo down hallways. They said I had provoked Ethan. They said I had a history of instability, that maybe the Army had promoted me out of pity, that my injuries were exaggerated. Lies spread faster than truth, when truth was inconvenient. The worst moment came when I walked into a small family gathering. Richard hosted in the base housing area. I had been told to attend to show unity. The house smelled of roast beef and bourbon, voices warm with cheer, but the moment I entered the room, the warmth dropped. Conversations faltered, eyes slid away, and Ethan stood at the center like a favored son, retelling a story of his weekend as though nothing had happened. My father introduced him proudly to an old colleague, calling him dependable and strong. When I tried to speak to remind the room who I was, Linda cut me off with a sharp smile and said, "We do not need to relive unpleasantness, dear." Laughter resumed, but none of it reached me. I sat at the edge of the room, invisible, every bite of food turning to ash in my mouth. Walking back to my quarters that night, the chill of the Carolina air burned my lungs, and I realized what they were doing. They were not just denying the truth. They were erasing me, rewriting the story so completely that soon I would exist only as a footnote of disgrace. The weight of it pressed harder than my bandages. To lose the acknowledgement of strangers was painful, but to lose the acknowledgement of your own blood, to see them lock arms around the very man who hurt you, that was a different kind of wound. Alone in my room, the silence became unbearable. I stared at the blank walls and wondered if this was how people disappeared, not by death, but by slow deletion from every circle, every memory, every story. That night, I made myself a promise. If they wanted me erased, I would become unforgettable instead. When I returned to the Carter house a few weeks later, summoned under the pretense of retrieving personal belongings, I walked through the yard, expecting nothing more than another round of cold silence. Instead, I froze when I saw smoke curling upward from a corner of the property. At first, I thought it was a trash fire, but as I drew closer, the acrid scent of charred fabric and old wood clawed at my throat. There, in a blackened heap, lay the remains of my mother's hope chest, the one piece of her legacy I had begged to keep after she died. I had hidden letters, their photographs, her wedding veil folded carefully, the quilt she had stitched by hand. All of it reduced to ash, the delicate embroidery turned to brittle threads, the photographs curling into nothing. I dropped to my knees, staring at the ruin, my body shaking with the kind of grief that has no sound. My hands reached out instinctively to touch what was left, but the heat seared my skin and I pulled back as tears blurred my vision. The chest had survived years of neglect, hidden in the attic like a quiet defiance against Linda's reign, and now it was gone in an instant, destroyed with the same precision my stepbrother had used against my body at the ceremony. Behind me, a voice cleared his throat. It was Manuel the gardener who had worked for the family longer than I had been alive. His face was lined with weather and loyalty, but his eyes carried sorrow as he spoke. "Señorita," he said softly, "I am sorry. I saw them. I saw Ethan pour the lighter fluid. Your father watched. He told him to burn it. Said, 'We clean up the past.'" Manuel shook his head, his hands trembling, and added that he had wanted to stop them but knew the order came from a man no one dared oppose. His words struck harder than the smoke in my lungs. Not only had they erased me from ceremonies and conversations, they had erased my mother's memory too, as though by burning her belongings they could wipe her existence from our lives entirely. It was not neglect anymore, it was purge. My grief twisted into rage so sharp I thought it might split me open. I staggered inside the house, the scent of smoke clinging to me, and demanded answers. Richard stood in the living room, his posture relaxed, drink in hand, as though nothing monumental had happened outside. Ethan leaned against the wall, smirking, the flicker of triumph in his eyes, undeniable. When I shouted, my voice cracking, asking how they could destroy the last pieces of my mother, my father simply said, "The past weakens us. We move forward." He turned his back as if the matter was closed. That dismissal carved deeper than any insult. It told me he did not see my mother as worthy of memory, and by extension, he did not see me as worthy of carrying her name. Linda entered, then her smile sharp as glass, and remarked that perhaps it was better this way, that holding on to relics only tethered me to weakness. I felt the walls close and the air grow thin, and for a moment I thought I might collapse from the enormity of their cruelty. I stumbled back outside the night air cutting against my wet cheeks and found Manuel waiting near the ashes. He pressed something into my hand, a small, scorched scrap of fabric he had pulled from the fire part of my mother's quilt. "Keep this," he whispered, "so they cannot erase everything." I clutched it to my chest, the smell of smoke and loss embedded in the threads, and knew I was standing at a crossroads. Either I let them finish erasing me, or I fight to etch my truth so deep it could never be burned away. That night, I sat in my car for hours, the scrap of quilt in my lap, the echoes of my father's words circling in my head. "We clean up the past." He believed he had won, that he had scorched the last ties to my mother and silenced me forever. But as I stared at the embers still glowing faintly in the yard, I realized fire could destroy, but it could also forge. If they wanted me to vanish into smoke, I would instead become something unbreakable, something that would rise from ashes. They thought the fire ended a chapter. I knew it had just lit the beginning of my war. I kept the charred scrap of my mother's quilt on the table in my quarters, a silent witness to everything that had been taken from me. Some nights I stared at it until the edges blurred through my tears, and other nights I pressed it against my chest as if it could shield me from the loneliness that gnawed at my ribs more fiercely than the fractures ever had. For weeks, I drifted between despair and fury, my body mending slowly while my spirit struggled to find footing. It would have been easy to collapse under the weight of silence to accept the version of reality my father had forced into the official record. Training accident. Family business. Nothing to see here. But the night I heard those words echo in my head, I also heard my mother's voice faint but steady. The same words she had whispered to me when I was a frightened girl. "The Lord is my strength and my shield." At first, that memory only deepened my grief because I longed for her presence, for her hands to guide me, for her voice to drown out the command of Richard Carter. But as I repeated the phrase in the quiet, something shifted. I realized that waiting for a shield from outside had left me unprotected my entire life. If no one else would defend me, not family, not commanders, not the army itself, then I would have to become my own shield. That thought lit something inside me that fire could not destroy. I began to act quietly, methodically. I documented every scar and bruise with photographs holding the camera steady, even when my hands shook. I wrote down dates, times, names, conversations, locking them in a notebook that never left my side. I reached out to Carla Jennings, the nurse who had whispered truth when everyone else chose silence, and she agreed to sign a statement of what she had witnessed. We talked in hushed tones, aware of the risks, but her courage steadied mine. Each page, each photo, each affidavit felt like a small piece of armor I was forging not for battlefields overseas, but for the battlefield inside my own family and institution. At night, I trained my mind the way I once trained my body, rehearsing what I would say if confronted, preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be my cage. I knew Richard would not stop. I knew Ethan would not suddenly repent. They had built their version of honor on my erasure, and I had finally accepted that waiting for them to change was a wasted life. I could not control their actions, but I could control my response. Slowly, the despair that had pressed me flat began to shift into resolve. My ribs still ached, my arms still stiff, but each pang of pain reminded me of survival. They had tried to crush me at my moment of triumph, and I was still here, breathing, thinking, planning. For the first time since that stage collapsed under me, I felt a strange, steady calm. Not the calm of surrender, but the calm of someone who has stopped asking for rescue and started building a defense. I was done pleading for my father's approval or for commanders to uphold their codes. My story would be told not through their reports, but through my evidence, my allies, my truth. That realization became my new oath. I had sworn once to defend the Constitution. Now I swore to defend myself, to shield the memory of my mother, to carve out a justice that could not be ordered to stand down. The first ally came in the form of a memory. I remembered whispers I had overheard back during my early days at Fort Bragg about private online forums, hidden places where women in uniform shared what they could not risk saying aloud in the barracks. Late one night, with my notebook open and the hum of my small desk lamp the only sound, I began searching. It took hours moving through obscure links, creating encrypted accounts, triple-checking that my trail was hidden. Finally, I found it a plain interface, faceless, anonymous, but alive with testimony. I did not post right away. I read. I absorbed stories that felt like echoes of my own. Women denied promotions so their male peers could shine. Women whose after-action reports had been rewritten until their bravery was erased. Women beaten by partners in uniform and told to keep quiet for the sake of the mission. Each confession was a scar etched into the silence, and I realized with a trembling breath that I was not alone. My first post was short, clinical, and deliberately vague. Has anyone ever had an official record modified to protect another service member's reputation? I logged off after pressing send, my hands cold against the keyboard. When I returned the next morning, my inbox overflowed. 17 messages had arrived overnight, and by the following day, over 50. The words leapt from the screen, filled with raw honesty and heartbreak. One message came from a major in the Air Force describing how her medal had been reassigned to the son of a general. Another from a Navy officer who had been silenced after reporting harassment. And then there was one line from a Marine captain I had never met, but her words seared into me. "Welcome to the sisterhood of the scars." I whispered the phrase aloud, tasting its weight. Sisterhood. Scars. Those two words crystallized the truth I was part of something larger than my own pain. My shield was no longer just mine. It was forged from the voices of women who had been silenced for decades. That realization gave me the courage to take the next step. I remembered Carla Jennings, the nurse who had seen my broken body firsthand and dared to whisper truth. I returned to Womack Army Medical Center not as a patient, but as a woman with purpose. I found her during her coffee break, sitting alone with tired eyes and a quiet dignity. When she looked up, recognition flickered across her face. I sat opposite her and said softly, "I am not here for treatment. I need your help." I explained carefully that I needed a sworn affidavit of my injuries, recorded the day I was admitted before anyone altered the record. Carla hesitated, her spoon circling her coffee cup as silence stretched between us. She had a penchant to protect a career built over decades, and standing with me could cost her everything. But then she set down her spoon and met my gaze. "In 30 years, she said, I have seen too many girls walk out of here with accidents no one would name." Her hand trembled only slightly as she pushed a notepad across the table. "Tell Tell me what to write, she said. I will sign it before a notary this afternoon. Relief crashed over me so strong my breath caught. Carla had just given me my first undeniable piece of evidence, and in that moment I knew she was no longer just a nurse. She was an ally. With that paper in hand, my next move was bolder. I contacted Evelyn Reed, a woman whose reputation I had heard whispered about in the same tones soldiers use for legends. She had once been a JAG prosecutor feared in courtrooms for her precision, her unflinching pursuit of justice. Now she worked as a civilian lawyer representing service members crushed by the very system that claimed to protect them. I sent her a message through an encrypted account outlining only enough details to gauge her interest. When she called me back 2 days later, her voice was firm low and sharp as steel. "Lieutenant Brooks," she said, "I have read your outline. I will take your case, but you must be prepared. This will not be quick. It will not be clean, and your enemies will not fight fair." I gripped the phone tighter. "I have already lost everything that can be burned," I said. "What remains cannot be destroyed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Evelyn replied, "Good. That means you are ready." With Evelyn's legal expertise, Carla's affidavit, and the sisterhood of the scars at my back, I no longer felt like a cornered soldier waiting for the next attack. I was assembling a unit, one that fought not with rifles or grenades, but with evidence, truth, and solidarity. Every night I studied protocols, learned about affidavits, chain of custody, Article 32 hearings. I filled my notebook with plans the way I once filled range cards with defensive positions. My father had his command. Ethan had his fists. I had the truth, and now I had allies who would help me carry it like a weapon. The first blow did not come with fists. It came through the television. I was sitting in a corner booth at a small Fayetteville coffee shop trying to quiet my mind with a book. The rich smell of roasted beans wrapped around me, the hum of quiet conversations almost soothing. Then I heard the sharp swell of a patriotic theme from the mounted TV above the counter. My eyes lifted and my stomach froze. On the screen sat Ethan, my stepbrother, dressed in immaculate blues medals gleaming under the studio lights. The banner at the bottom of the screen read, "A Family's Sacrifice. Marine Hero Speaks Out." I couldn't breathe. He spoke with polished ease, the same voice that once hissed insults while pressing broken glass to my skin. Now he was the image of composure, telling the nation about Syria, about a mission I remembered all too well. Only in his version, he was the calm leader, the anchor in chaos, while I was the unstable cousin who faltered under pressure. I clenched my hands under the table nails, digging crescents into my palms. The host leaned forward, voice heavy with rehearsed sympathy. "Captain Carter, there have been rumors about your cousin, Lieutenant Brooks. How is she coping?" Ethan lowered his head, shook it slowly as though weighed down by sorrow. "I love her," he said, voice thick with practiced grief. "But combat changes people. She's not stable right now. She's a danger to herself and the people around her." I felt the words strike like a hammer. He hadn't just stolen my courage, he had branded me. Unstable, dangerous, a ticking bomb of PTSD in front of millions. The segment ended with the host thanking him for his service, the camera lingering on his solemn expression, his medals shining like stolen stars. I sat frozen until the commercial rolled. Not anger yet, analysis. The enemy had launched a propaganda campaign. It was clean, effective, lethal. By the time I left the cafe, whispers already followed me. In Fayetteville, faces turned in the cereal aisle, eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. At the Harris Teeter checkout line, an older woman with a gold eagle pin stepped in front of me. Her hair was neat, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You should be ashamed," she said loudly so everyone could hear. "My husband served 30 years and people like you disgrace the uniform." Every head in line turned. The cashier froze. I stood still, the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck. I did not argue. I only held her gaze until she looked away. Then I paid in silence and left the weight of 100 condemning stares pressing on my back. Back in my motel room, the whispers continued not from strangers this time, but from the digital world. My name appeared on forums threads filled with half-truths and outright lies. Anonymous accounts claimed they had served with me and seen my instability. Others said I was trying to bring down honorable men out of jealousy. Richard's hand was clear. He was pulling every string, leveraging every old boy's connection to craft a narrative where his daughter was a liability to the core. The strategy was simple: isolate me, discredit me, make my truth unbelievable before I even opened my mouth. Alone in that dim room, the television muted, I felt the walls closing in. This was not just family betrayal anymore. It was a coordinated campaign. They were turning my service, my sacrifice, my very identity into a weapon against me. My breath came shallow, but then I remembered the notebook on the nightstand, the signed affidavit tucked inside the encrypted emails piling up from the Sisterhood of the Scars. Their words steadied me. I was not unstable. I was not alone. Still, the smear hurt. It cut deep because it twisted the one thing I had given everything to protect: my honor. They thought if they buried me under enough lies, the world would never bother to dig for the truth. They were wrong. Lies burn fast, but truth endures, and I was preparing to light my truth where the whole world could see. The day smelled of summer and history. Washington, D.C. in late May carries a weight all its own: humid air clinging to skin and the low hum of tourists filling the mall. I stood among them, just another anonymous face, but my heart pounded with a rhythm sharper than any parade drum. Before me stretched the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the names etched deep, shimmering faintly under the pale sky. I thought of my mother as I touched the cool stone, her voice reminding me that truth is the only honor worth keeping. Then I turned to the stage. Ethan arrived like a conquering hero. His uniform was spotless, his medals polished until they caught the sun and threw it back into the eyes of the crowd. He smiled, shook hands, posed for photographs, a golden boy draped in stolen valor. Cameras clicked. Applause followed him as though it were choreographed. I stayed still, hidden in the mass of bodies waiting. When he took the podium, silence rippled outward. His voice rolled smooth across the lawn, practiced lines about sacrifice and courage tumbling easily from his lips. He spoke of brotherhood of soldiers who never came home, and all the while he used their memory as his shield. I listened, each word a knife twisting into the truth of what I had lived. My fists clenched at my sides, not from rage, but from focus. He was a fraud, standing in front of the names of the true and the brave. The moment came at the end of his speech. Applause swelled, polite and restrained. He stepped back from the podium, basking in the glow of adoration. That was when I moved. I did not run. I did not shout. I walked forward with steady steps, weaving through the clusters of people as though parting a quiet sea. Heads turned as I passed, curiosity sparking. My eyes never left him. He saw me when I was 10 feet away, and for the first time in months, his smile faltered. His lips stiffened, his posture twitched, his mask cracked. The chatter around us fell silent. The air shifted charged, as if everyone sensed something inevitable was about to unfold. I stopped directly in front of him, close enough that the crowd could hear every word without me raising my voice. I looked not at the audience, not at the cameras, but directly into his eyes. "The medals on your chest," I said slowly, "belong to the men and women who actually bled for them. Do you ever feel ashamed standing in front of these names?" My chin tipped toward the wall behind him. 58,000 etched sacrifices staring back at us. The color drained from his face. For a heartbeat, he tried to summon his usual charm, his lips twitching into a weak imitation of his practiced smile. But the crowd was already murmuring, their eyes darting between me, him, and the memorial. He stammered, "What? What are you talking about?" His voice cracked, carrying none of the composure he had projected seconds before. A low wave of whispering rolled across the lawn. I took a step closer, my words sharp, deliberate. "You can steal a medal, you can steal a story, but you cannot steal honor, Ethan, because you never had it to begin with." The sentence hung in the humid air like a verdict. His face contorted, shifting from panic to fury, but he said nothing. He couldn't. The silence from the crowd grew heavier, pressing down like a physical weight. People stared at him, then at me, then back to the wall as though the stone itself had judged him. I turned my back on him then, not waiting for a response, not granting him the dignity of further attention. My boots pressed into the grass as I walked back into the sea of onlookers. Behind me, I heard gasps, whispers, even the faint click of phones recording. The confrontation had ended in less than 2 minutes, but its ripples would spread far beyond this lawn. As I melted into the crowd, I felt the granite at my back, the weight of names carved in sacrifice. For the first time since that bloody day at Fort Bragg, I felt that the silence was breaking. My stepbrother's carefully crafted facade had cracked in front of strangers, in front of cameras, in front of history itself. I exhaled, slowly, steady, and calm. This was not the end. It was only the opening volley of the war I had chosen. When the summons arrived folded neatly in a manila envelope, I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it. Cumberland County Superior Court. Assault charges filed against Ethan Carter. My father's name appeared too, not as a defendant, but noted in the witness list, which made my stomach clench. I knew what that meant. Richard Carter would be there, polished, controlled, ready to defend his son and bury his daughter once again. But this time I was not walking in alone. Evelyn Reed walked beside me, her heels striking the marble floor of the courthouse with quiet authority. She looked at me once before we entered, her gaze steady. Today, Lieutenant, the truth speaks louder than their lies. Inside the courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, a mixture of wood oil and bureaucracy. The jury sat in a neat row, 12 pairs of eyes assessing everything. Ethan was already there at the defense table. He looked immaculate, dressed in a pressed suit instead of his uniform, his face set in an expression of reluctant sorrow. He had perfected the look of the wronged hero. Beside him sat his lawyer, a slick man with silver cufflinks and a voice like silk. Richard Carter sat directly behind them in the front row, his posture rigid, his expression blank. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the steel, the silent warning that had ruled my life since childhood. The prosecution laid out the case first. Photographs of my injuries, hospital records that had somehow survived Richard's interference, and testimony from neighbors who had seen me leave Fort Bragg that night, bruised and bloodied. I told my story in clear, measured words, my voice steady even when my stomach twisted. Then it was Ethan's turn. His lawyer rose, voice smooth, spinning a tale of family tension, of a sister prone to emotional outbursts, of an accident misinterpreted. He painted Ethan as the devoted older brother who had only tried to protect me. Ethan played his part with brilliance. He kept his eyes soft, his voice low, describing how I had been unstable since returning from deployment, how I had struggled with pressure. He even bowed his head at one point, his voice breaking as he said, "I love my sister, but she is not well." The jury shifted uneasily. I could see doubt creeping in like smoke. Then the defense presented their so-called proof. A falsified medical report stamped and signed showing my broken arm dated months before the assault. They held it high for the jury to see. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not evidence of an attack. It is evidence of instability, a pattern of behavior. The words hung heavy, twisting reality like a blade. For a moment, I felt the weight of defeat pressing down. But Evelyn Reed rose, her expression calm, her eyes sharp. She walked to the center of the courtroom, pausing until every eye was on her. "That was a very compelling story," she said evenly. "So compelling, in fact, that I think this court deserves to see the moment that earned Mr. Carter his medal." She gestured toward the screen at the front of the room. The judge raised an eyebrow but allowed it. Lights dimmed. The video began. Grainy footage filled the screen, the chaos of Syria erupting in gunfire and dust. The camera tilted, showing me dragging 2 wounded Marines behind a wall, my hands working fast to bandage a bleeding leg. Then the camera caught Ethan huddled against the rubble, his rifle trembling, his face contorted in fear. The audio cut clear. A Marine's voice, hoarse with pain, said, "Thanks, Brooks. You saved my life." Silence fell like a stone. The jury's faces shifted, eyes widening, lips parting. The image of Ethan terrified contrasted with the medals pinned to his chest in photographs the jury had already seen. Evelyn let the silence linger before nodding. No further questions. Ethan's face had drained of color. He stammered when asked to explain, his voice cracking. But the blow was not finished. Evelyn's assistant pressed another button and audio filled the room. My father's voice, cold and commanding. "Get rid of her after-action report. Bury it." The reputation of the Carter family matters more than the feelings of one emotional girl. Gasps erupted. For the first time, I turned my gaze fully to Richard Carter. His mask cracked. His eyes darted, his jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The jury had heard the truth. When it was my turn to speak again, I walked slowly to the stand. I did not look at Ethan. I did not look at Richard. I faced the jury. I told them about that night at Fort Bragg, the blood on my uniform the military police ordered to stand down. I held up a small pendant. I now wore a twisted piece of metal reforged from the ashes of my burned medals. They tried to destroy my past, I said, my voice steady. They burned my uniforms, my commendations, my history. But they cannot burn my honor. That is mine, and it will not be erased. The courtroom was silent. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. The judge's gavel came down hours later. The verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts: assault, perjury, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Ethan Carter was sentenced to 15 years in military prison and stripped of every rank he had ever claimed. He sat at the defense table, pale and hollow, staring into nothing. My father, though not convicted criminally, was left shattered by the exposure. His reputation was tarnished, his career already hanging by a thread. The courtroom emptied, reporters buzzing like hornets outside. But I walked past them out into the Carolina sun, my heart heavy but steady. The Civil War had been fought. The truth had spoken. And yet, I knew there was another battlefield waiting. The military does not end with civilian court. The Article 32 hearing loomed, and that would be the true test of whether justice in uniform could stand against men like Richard Carter. The Article 32 hearing was nothing like the civilian courtroom. Civilian trials carried wood-paneled solemnity, but military justice was sharper, colder, framed by regulations rather than tradition. The hearing convened inside a plain building at Fort Bragg, the same installation where my blood had stained a promotion stage. Walking back onto the base made my stomach twist, but Evelyn Reed walked beside me, her calm presence grounding me. She explained what was about to unfold. Article 32, she said, is the military's version of a grand jury. The convening authority, a major general, had appointed an investigating officer, a JAG lawyer of major rank, to determine if enough evidence existed to move forward with a court-martial. The room was smaller than I expected, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the American flag and Army flag posted in the corner. A long table held the investigating officer at the head, his uniform immaculate, his eyes impassive. Ethan sat at the defense table again, this time in uniform, flanked by 2 Army defense counsels. Behind him sat Richard Carter, rigid and silent, his presence as heavy as the rank still on his shoulders, though everyone knew he was already under pressure to retire. My seat was across from them. My palms sweated as I gripped the chair, but I kept my spine straight. This was not about theater. This was about record. The proceedings began with formality. The charges were read: assault on a commissioned officer, conduct unbecoming falsification of records. My heart pounded hearing them laid out in clinical precision. Ethan's counsel moved quickly, arguing that this was a family dispute, not a military matter, that what had happened at the promotion ceremony was regrettable, but private, unrelated to the needs of good order and discipline. They spoke of emotions, of rivalry, of misunderstandings. They gestured toward me with rehearsed sympathy, describing me as emotional and fragile. I felt the words cut, but kept my eyes locked on the investigating officer. Then came the witnesses. Carla Jennings was the first. She sat in her nurse's scrubs, her voice soft but steady. She described the injuries she had treated the night of the assault. The broken bones, the lacerations, the visible trauma. She confirmed the discrepancies in the record, the changes ordered after the fact. She did not embellish. She simply told the truth, and her signature on the affidavit backed her every word. The defense tried to rattle her, asking if she might have confused dates or misremembered under stress. Carla did not flinch. "I have been a nurse for 30 years, she said. "I know what I saw." Next was Dorian Lex, my former fellow officer. He looked tired, worn down, but when he pressed a small USB drive into evidence, the room shifted. The recording played the audio crisp. My father's voice filled the chamber, cold and commanding. "Get rid of her after action report. Bury it. The reputation of the Carter family is more important than the feelings of one emotional girl. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The investigating officer leaned forward slightly, his pen scratching across the notepad. The defense stammered, claiming the recording was taken out of context, but the damage was done. Then came Mr. Manuel, the gardener who had watched my mother's hope chest burn. He looked out of place in his straw hat and plain shirt, but his testimony carried weight. He told the panel how Richard had carried the chest out himself, how Ethan had lit the match, how the words "clean up the past" had been spoken. The defense objected, claiming it was irrelevant, but the investigating officer allowed it, noting that it spoke to motive, to intent, to a pattern of destruction. Finally, it was my turn. I stood and spoke of the promotion ceremony, of the anthem, the orders, the pinning of rank. I described the moment Ethan's fist cracked bone, and the moment my father told the military police to stand down. I explained how those words, internal handling, meant no report, no justice. For a moment, I faltered, the memory pressing tears to my eyes, but then I remembered the sisterhood of the scars, the women whose stories filled my inbox. I steadied my breath and finished strong. The defense tried once more, insisting this was a family matter, that I was bitter and exaggerating. But by then, the room had shifted. The investigating officer looked up from his notes and addressed the record. "The evidence presented is sufficient. The charges against Captain Ethan Carter will proceed to a general court-martial. As for Lieutenant Colonel Richard Carter, the panel recommends forced retirement at a reduced grade." The words struck like thunder. For years, Richard Carter had ruled my life, his rank, his shield. Now in a military building filled with uniforms and flags, that shield had cracked. Ethan's face drained of color, his jaw slack. Richard's eyes flickered with rage, but even he knew the power of regulation when written into official record. The session adjourned, the investigating officer rising to leave. The room emptied slowly. I sat for a moment longer, staring at the flag in the corner. For the first time, I felt the Army itself had seen me, not as a daughter to be silenced, but as an officer wronged. Walking out into the sunlight, Evelyn touched my arm. "This was only the first battle," she said, "but you won today." I nodded. The Article 32 hearing was not the end. It was the foundation, and now the world would know the truth in the language of uniformed justice. When the gavel fell at the civilian trial and the recommendation echoed in the Article 32 hearing, I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt hollow, as though the battlefield inside me had gone quiet and left behind only exhaustion. Ethan was led away in handcuffs, sentenced to 15 years and dishonor that would stain his name forever. Richard Carter, my father, my commander, the man whose approval had shaped and shackled my life, was ordered into retirement at a reduced rank. Stripped of the power he had wielded like a sword, he walked out of that hearing not as a lieutenant colonel, but as a man diminished. Yet there was no victory march for me, no medal pinned to my chest, just silence. In the weeks that followed, I received offers of reinstatement apologies written in stiff bureaucratic language letters that pretended the system had worked. A colonel slid across his desk the medal I had earned years before, polished and set inside a velvet case. It should have meant everything. Instead, I closed the box and pushed it back. They burned my medals once, I told him. They can try to give them back, but my honor was never theirs to grant or take away. I walked out of that office lighter than I had ever been. I chose separation not as a disgraced soldier, but as a woman who had completed her final mission. Leaving the Army was like shedding armor I had worn for a decade. I used the settlement money and compensation to buy a small cottage on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It was weathered white paint peeling, perched just far enough from the beach that salt air kissed the windows at dawn. The first night I slept there, I opened the windows wide and let the sound of the waves replace the hum of barracks generators. Peace came slowly, not in a sudden rush, but like the tide seeping into corners I thought would always be dark. I began to walk the beach barefoot each morning. The Atlantic was cool, even in summer foam curling around my ankles, the horizon stretching wide like possibility. With each step, I felt more distance from the stage at Fort Bragg, from the blood on my promotion uniform, from the crushing silence of commanders who turned their heads. For months, I lived quietly. I planted sunflowers in a patch of sandy soil by my porch rows of bright faces that turned to follow the sun. I liked watching them because they reminded me of survival. No matter how harsh the wind, no matter how heavy the storm, they lifted their heads and sought the light. That was what I wanted for myself. One rainy afternoon, I unpacked the last box I had carried from my past. It was filled with my mother's old books, spines softened from use, pages smelling faintly of cedar. As I lifted out a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, I felt a shift at the bottom of the box. A false panel came loose, revealing a sealed envelope. My mother's handwriting swept across the front for my Natalie. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter inside was short, but each word carved itself into me. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, but my love is not. The world will try to silence you. It will tell you to bury your truth for the sake of family, for the sake of honor. But true honor lives only in the truth, your truth. Please, my darling, use your voice. Be the fire I never dared to be. Know that wherever I am proud of you. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears spilling hot down my face. For years, I had fought to live up to my father's definition of honor. Here, in her final words, my mother gave me a new definition, one that was mine alone. That night, I sat on the porch listening to the rain. I hung the pendant I had forged from my melted metal on a hook by the door. It no longer felt like a weapon. It sang with the wind, scattering fractured rainbows across the porch. Even scarred things could make beauty. In the months that followed, I found a new purpose. I began volunteering at a small veterans outreach center in town. It was nothing glamorous, just a cramped building with fluorescent lights and endless pots of coffee. At first, I only listened sitting in folding chairs as other veterans spoke of sleepless nights and invisible wounds. Then, one evening, I told my story. Not the polished courtroom version, but the messy, painful truth. When I finished, the room was silent. A young former medic looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "Me too," she whispered, 2 words that built a bridge. From then on, every Tuesday night we gathered. Sometimes 5 women, sometimes 15, sitting in a circle under buzzing lights, sharing scars no one else wanted to see. We called it Sisterhood of the Scars, reborn not in anonymous forums, but in a room where voices could rise without fear. That became my legacy, not the rank I had earned or the medals burned, but the circle of women who found strength in each other. Each time I heard someone whisper me too, I felt the fire in me burn steadier, not to destroy, but to illuminate. My father never came to see me again. Richard Carter faded into quiet disgrace, a retired officer stripped of respect. Ethan's letters arrived once written from confinement, but I never opened them. They belonged to the past ashes scattered by a fire that no longer defined me. My story was not theirs anymore. It was mine. One evening at sunset, standing barefoot in the sand, I whispered into the wind as though my mother could hear me. "I am using my voice, Mom. I am using it because justice was never the end of my story. It was the beginning." The sun was low on the horizon when I finally felt ready to let go of the last piece of my past. I stood in front of my small cottage on the Outer Banks, the air thick with the scent of salt and pine gulls calling in the distance. In my hand was the twisted fragment of metal that had once been a medal melted and bent, saved from the ashes of what my father and Ethan had burned. For months it had hung by the porch as a wind chime, ringing soft and steady, a reminder of pain and endurance. That evening I lifted it gently and carried it down to the shoreline. The waves stretched wide, endless, as though daring me to believe in new beginnings. I walked into the surf until the cold water touched my calves. Then I lifted the metal high and whispered, "They tried to bury me, but I am still here." I let the fragment drop, and the ocean carried it away, erasing its weight from my hands. I stood there long after letting the water lap against me, feeling something inside me loosen for the first time in years. That night, I returned to the porch and opened my mother's letter again. The paper was creased from being read so many times, but her words were still alive. "True honor lives in the truth, your truth." I repeated it aloud like a prayer, like an oath renewed with every breath. For so long, I had believed honor belonged to ranks, to medals, to the approval of men like Richard Carter. Now I knew better. Honor was not something pinned to a uniform. It was something forged in scars carried in voices that refused to be silenced. In the weeks that followed, our small sisterhood of the scars grew. Women drove hours from other bases from Virginia, from South Carolina, from Georgia. They came not for therapy, but for truth. Each woman brought her own story, her own wound, and each time we gathered, the room filled with a strength that no general's order could erase. Sometimes I sat quietly and just listened, watching as voices once trembled and then grew steady. Other times I told my story again, not to relive the pain, but to remind them that survival was possible, that scars were not endings, but beginnings. One evening, a woman older than me, gray, streaking her hair, took my hand and said softly, "You made me believe again." I carried her words with me like another metal, one they could never burn. My father's name might still hold weight in some corners, Ethan's lies might still echo in distant ears, but here in this circle of voices their power was gone. The truth had carved its own space, and no one could erase it now. I do not know what the future will bring. Some days, the waves of memory still crash hard, dragging me back to the stage at Fort Bragg, the sting of bone breaking the silence of commanders who looked away. But when those memories rise, I remind myself that I stood again, that I spoke again, that I was not erased. I carry my scars as proof, not of weakness, but of survival. And if you have listened to me this far, if you have felt the weight of injustice in your own life, then you know that survival is not enough. Our voices matter. They must be heard. So I ask you now, not as a soldier, but as a woman who refused to be silenced, leave your voice here with mine. Write 3 simple words. My voice matters. Let them echo louder than the lies, louder than the silence, louder than the fire that tried to destroy me. Because in the end, metals rust, ranks fade, and even names carved into stone can be forgotten. But voices, our voices carry on, and together they cannot be silenced.